This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jim McDonald. Jeff Stedman is on special assignment, but I've got a special episode for you today. It's the Sponsor Spotlight, and the Sponsor Spotlight episodes are made possible by support from our sponsors. In this case, today it is a company called Tuebora. So stay tuned, learn about them. We're also going to be talking about a very interesting topic or two that is educational and entertaining, hopefully. And to help me with this conversation, I've got Sanjay Nadampally. He's the CEO and founder over at Tuebora. And welcome to the show, Sanjay.
Thanks, Jim, for having me over. Happy to be here and talk about what we're doing.
Really appreciate you being here. I know you've been in the industry for over 2 decades, and that's exciting. Anytime we have somebody with that extensive a history on the podcast, I'd like to ask you, how did you get into identity? We always ask all of our first-time guests, how did you get into identity? And is this something you chose, or did identity choose you?
Oh, good question. Many years ago, before Tuebora, I joined Avexa as one of the 2 engineers. In fact, the first 2 engineers. I still remember Deepak Taneja, who's the founder of Avexa, coming with a 2-pager and saying, "This is what we are going to build." And the idea was kind of very simple and clear at that point in time. It was about how do you create a centralized repository for identity and access and collect data from disparate systems and show what relationships they have and do some access reviews and access requests on them. And then it kind of gave me what I would call as a front seat experience, in terms of how this space was. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen this evolve. It just feels like, that model has still stayed in organizations today. Fundamentally, that blueprint of collecting data, looking at the relationships, understanding what it is still the same, except that the speed and scale of that and the complexity has evolved over the years.
So interesting that you brought up Deepak Taneja. He is the CEO over at Zilla, which was acquired by CyberArk, and he was on the podcast a while back as well. So now we've come full circle. Tell us a little bit about.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool, right? Tell us a little bit about Tuebora. What does Tuebora do essentially?
So essentially, what we are trying to do is. The space itself has evolved in a way like we talked about, where we brought in automation and building that warehouse of identity and access. And what we bring to the table is today, if you see the problem that is out there, it's just not about governing access. It is about bringing in explainability and intelligence into governance. That's where we fit in. So we shift the pendulum from pure governance into something that's more intelligent and explainable. That's where we come in, and we bring in that expertise into various processes in the IM space.
Yeah, this whole idea of intelligence is one that I can't wait to dive into with you. And its entry into identity and identity governance as a whole. But at first, just the name Tuebora, I would love to hear, what is the background story for how you chose that name?
Good question. So we're looking for something that could be, catchy and doesn't necessarily reflect, security directly, but we just wanted something that's more representative of that. So Tubor in Latin means I will protect, I will defend. So this is just an extension of the word Tubor, and we just said, okay, let's go with Tubora.
I like that. And also the domain had to be available, right? Tuebora.com, and you were able to snap that up.
That's correct.
Yeah, by that time that you started the company, that wasn't to be taken for granted, right? So I want to jump back into this topic of configuration in identity, or I'm sorry, intelligence and identity. And when we were talking the other day, you kind of talked about how intelligence can replace configuration, and I wanted to know a little bit more about that concept. What is the possibility there, and can intelligence replace configuration?
Sure. See, it- the model of any application is, configuration kind of becomes the default for any application to be set up and for the right reasons. But the issue is that every organization is so different and every application behaves so differently, and what you need to apply in terms of your business processes, meeting your requirements, everything kind of changes, within an organization across applications, and as you think about every enterprise out there. So, what you really need is something that can capture what we call as what you intend to do in terms of your governance, right? We really want to understand organizations' intent, how they want to govern, and the areas where they need help in their understanding, and what we want to do through the platform itself. So we want to be able to make it very effective and produce them the right outcome. So configuration does not mean you're getting the right outcome, right? Configuration just means going through the motion of setting up an application. So we want to focus on bringing in that intelligence so that you are able to continuously see what's happening, get information about the current state, the current context, the changes that are happening in the enterprise, and bring all of that into something that is more explainable, something that will help them align with their current environment. In some sense, think of it as a very adaptive model of governance for the enterprise. So, if you stick to configuration, your solution will align only to the configuration that you provide. And the changes are not something that the configuration is going to hold on to. So, the model will be, how do you build a system where the configuration, in some sense, is kind of dynamic? It's evolving as the enterprise is evolving, right? That's where intelligence comes into being. And you don't want to treat this as some static model, right? In terms of how this is done. I think fundamentally that is what is going to change how organizations should think about their governance activities and have an adaptive model that is adjusting to what's happening within their environment. And most of the time, people don't have the workforce or the process or a mechanism in place to see every identity signal that is impacting their business. So, how do you make sure you get information, you can tap into those signals intelligently and come back and present the best outcome for the enterprise and let them make those decisions? Yes, intelligence means you're bringing in some tools and techniques that AI provides, but at the end of the day, you allow them to make those decisions because they are the ones who are going to be responsible for those decisions, and we want to allow them to be making those decisions.
Yeah, and the thing I hear you really emphasizing there is the static nature of configurations, right? Whereas using intelligence can be much more dynamic. That seems like it's a huge benefit. I'd say the other thing is not to be assumed, because I know this from experience. Configuring a system is not just like, oh, you configure it and ship it into production. It's a lot of work. It requires going through, a long period of time to actually do the work, to decide on the configurations, and then to UAT test them and things like that. And you're not so quick to change them. So it can become a very difficult process that needs to go through change management and yada yada. So having, having seen that model myself over a couple of decades of being in on the services side of identity, I can see why this is a major shift. And I, I guess what I'd ask you is, like, do you kind of agree with that second part that I put out there? Like, I feel like that's a big reason why it's kind of showing its limitations today, especially given what's available now with the AI models that are becoming available.
Right. Absolutely. I think you made a valid observation there. See, the thing is that um, configuration capture the mechanics of what needs to be done, right? And they don't really represent your intent. And that's why when you think about how do you manage this, you want something that's more uh, continuous and that's more evolving, and it understands the risk boundaries because the risk boundaries are changing, and you really want to emphasize on that. And that's where intelligence can bring in that interpretation, and it can interpret context, and then it can evaluate the policy and suggest the right set of actions that you need to take. It could be certain remediations you need to take, and sometimes it would also mean that the recommendations need to be done in a timely manner, and the only way you're going to achieve that also is to bring in the runtime AI into the mix of things. That's where the AI agents come in. So there is one aspect of just understanding your current state, making recommendations, and then once you sign off on those recommendations, we again want the ability for AI to perform those activities. So that's where the runtime pieces come into play. So there are two things that always go hand in hand. And one is bring in intelligence to understand the state, interpret the context and bring in those recommendations, and the post sign off actually executing them. So in many ways you are taking the full life cycle of governance in a way that's kind of repeatable for the enterprise, right? And you're not really uh, mandating an army of people to not just go to the analysis, but to be able to execute that. So the traditional model, like you're talking about, was you had a big team of services folk coming in and doing this analysis. And once they get sign off, they are the ones who are actually going to modify the configurations and go do the execution side of things. So this all gets compressed. So the business value for an IM solution is quickly seen and leveraged, and they can build on a model like this where the life cycle of the governance activities is compressed in a significant way.
So the analysis takes place by intelligence, which I was picking up on that earlier. But the part that you just brought up, I think is important because I brought up the idea of like change management, maybe having to go through some processes to automate the implementation of the changes. And it sounds like that's part of this intelligence story as well, which is really just not trying to bypass traditional controls that an organization might have for any software changes, but to work within those boundaries and make them more efficient at it. So I think that's exciting. And it kind of segues into my next question because, you know, where I wanted to go next was around what are you hearing from customers in terms of their frustration. I think this also just bringing it back to that last point is this is a benefit from a customer standpoint because they if you can't work with existing change control processes, if you can't automate the process to push things into production when they have been approved, then they'd have to change that process or get an exception, which is kind of a headache. Um, but what I wanted to talk about was when you talk to customers, what are their biggest frustrations with having to deal with these environments that oftentimes they're maybe inheriting from kind of a legacy either team or maybe they built them themselves, but they built configurations and customization. Maybe they've created some bolt-on capabilities over time, and now they've got they're saddled with all this technology. So, what are the areas that are creating the biggest frustrations for them?
Sure. I think when you think about customers, they kind of probably don't uh, complain about what the conceptual goals of provisioning access requests or access reviews are going wrong. Right? They complain about maintaining that, right? Making sure there's a continuum around those goals. So when you think about customers, whether they are in the midst of an acquisition or they're restructuring or changes are happening to their applications or there is a policy update that they need, or there is a change to a regulatory requirement, or you have to drive through a certain exception for certain reasons. All of these means that you have to bring in the configuration to accept these definitions, these constructs, right? It's just too cumbersome for them. And they're always complaining, I have a situation, but I can't express it because the application doesn't allow me to configure that, right? Because it's difficult to express that. So when you think about that problem, what it means is that why do you have to work through the same model of administrative burden of going into each policy or going to each application, getting that configured? So we find that they would want to say, why can't you give me something that's expressive, right? People went from UI configuration, they went through some language constructs to do this, saying give me an expression language to do that, which also meant you need a very more sophisticated person to come and do this. And then, fast forward, we are in a world where some of these things can be done in a more simplified manner. And that's where we find that what if they can describe this in natural language, right? Whatever they intend to do, and let the system figure out when it is actually evaluating and executing, do what it needs to do underneath in terms of building it out, right? So that way, you are collaborating and engaging with the customer in the most expressive way, because that's how you would want to do it. And that's where the power of intelligence comes into being, is to be able to not just interpret what's happening in their IT landscape, but also understand what they want to do with that landscape. And they can bring in their needs in the form of requirements that can come in the form of text. They can bring in their PowerPoints. They can bring in sample data. They can bring everything that they know about their environment and their intent, and they don't have to go through the configuration of the application, the IM application, to get that set up. And let that drive the conversation, because when you think about security, when you think about risk, it is just not a one-way activity where the customer or the business user is configuring something and let it do, and you don't know whether what you are configured is actually what you are getting the outcome from. So this is a more of a collaborative nature of working through your IAM needs. And I think that's where the complexity of the IAM processes kind of is brought down. So you're now empowering a business user to work with an IAM system. That's not happened in the industry, because the business user was still working with the service provider and the SME to take care of their IAM needs. I think that is shifting today. We're saying, no, I know what I want to do, and I'm going to talk to the IAM system in the most expressive way and let that drive the operational activities for me. And then I'm certainly going to be person who is the authority to who's the authority to sign off on it. But I'm reducing the dependency on the external people who may or may not know as well as you do about the processes, right? And that's where I think the disconnect between the needs of the business with what the solutions out there, is largely going to go away. We believe, with this, natural synergy that the AI is going to bring, especially through this natural language interaction. That's where Tuebora fits in to say, you bring your needs and you bring it in multiple forms that you can. We will work, with you on that and take you through this journey for you, as opposed to, you know, uh, configure and forget and hope for the best. Right? There is no hope for the
Yeah.
best. We are. This is a. That's why. This is not about quarterly reviews that keep coming up, right? Oh, people do quarterly access reviews. Everybody's happy. Auditor is happy. Tick mark. They're all good. It doesn't work like that. Access management is largely a continuous process. There are changes that are happening, identity signals that are coming out there. Who is sitting and monitoring them? There is nobody sitting and monitoring them, and nobody even making those intelligent analysis around that. So customers, I think, have started to believe that there is this shift that can happen, and they will see significant benefits in that shift. And we are, in that journey to make that happen with them.
You know what I think was so exciting when you're talking about that is, it's not like everybody who listens to this podcast, I'm sure, is using AI and is doing some combination of prompting, using files, or pointing to web links, and basically conversing with the AI to get to the right thing. And as you were describing uploading files, I imagine uploading policies or any past documentation of how it's supposed to work, but also just having conversing with the AI, training it on how you want it to work. It's very similar to the tools we're using for pretty much everything from how to build a PowerPoint to, you know, basically all applications are, outside of InfoSec 2 are starting to just use this AI natural language model. I think we're going to see it more and more over time, but I'm getting the sense because it's also a great transition because I wanted to get into, we talked a lot about why you'd want to do this. And I think it's now time to talk about like how you do this. And one of the things you've been talking about for a while, I've heard you talk about is letting intelligence drive outcomes rather than forcing administrators to kind of like think of every different scenario and build a configuration for that. I mean, this most simple scenario I can think of in IGA, like phase one is, all right, here's the process we want to use to configure an email address. Well, what if somebody already has that name? Then what do we do? And now you have to build this complex like jot file on like how to handle all these different things. Or maybe you're using a system where it's like there's more configuration options, but either way, it's a pain in the butt. I'm wondering, is that kind of like now having intelligence drive those types of things rather than thinking of every different scenario that you might run into in terms of that configuration? Or maybe just tell us what you meant by having intelligence drive outcomes.
Sure, absolutely. So we talked about how configurations are going to be simplified, through intelligence. Right. Let's take a look at a few more things, that come to my mind. So one is around the fact that the intelligence can come back and tell you that here are some missing or inconsistent controls in your environment. It comes and says, here is a recommendation, right? Or it can come and propose policies and highlight that, what, based on this data and this analysis, it looks like you need these policies, in your environment. Right? And whoever is performing any kind of review, it can come back and give you a context that is not available otherwise, right? In terms of your decision making, right? And then instead of treating everything with the same, pair of eyes, in terms of how it should be addressed. So you can look at what is more critical, what is more averse to, prone to risk and things like that. So it can build that knowledge that you don't have, and we can, as a system, we can bring that out as well. And then The more you dig deeper into this, one of the things that happens is the governance posture, as we call it. Every organization doesn't know what we call as governance debt. They don't know what governance debt they have in their environment. So intelligence can actually put some metrics around that governance debt and say, by the way, you started at the beginning of the year, at this point, here are all the transitions and the changes that have occurred. And here is how you are seeing improvement. Improvement could be in reduction trends going in a certain way, less requests coming in, right? Better throughput in terms of provisioning and deprovisioning, and then more coverage in terms of policies. It is not just narrowed down to few things, right? And more explainability in what is happening, in your environment. So ultimately, the system can help you not just do automation, but focus on high risk and some of these, ambiguous, things that come into surface and help them, make those decisions that you need. So the design principle fundamentally is about using intelligence through the platform like ours, and is building progressive trust, right? So your governance debt, reduction, and building that progressive trust, through this platform. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about AI, there is always, there is that question that people have: Hey, what is it doing for me? Am I comfortable with it? Can I trust it, to do certain things? So, what we suggest is, you take a phased approach in what you're trying to do with this model, and build that trust. Build with certain set of applications, certain set of processes, certain set of policies, and take them towards that journey. And then it quickly results in better outcomes, because we'll always be driven by metrics, right? Every one of these is certainly driven through metrics, and then the boundaries in which these are enforced, and explainability, right? Absolutely, the core piece of this is explainability, and bringing in information about if it's a non-use, or if it's a role change, or if it's a deviation from peer access situation, if it's a policy conflict, if it's a control violation, if it is something that is an anomaly, from its judgment standpoint, or it sounds like this could be a risk signal. Because at the end of the day, you want it to tell us something that is likely to happen, as opposed to after the fact. And after the fact, the damage is done, and you will have very little remediation opportunity. So it's more about treating those, signals, as opposed to being a static monitoring system, right? You just want it to be a continuous governance platform that's driven by intelligence, addresses your governance, debt, builds that trust, over a period of time, with sufficient explanation for every action that is presented to you.
So I'm going to ask the question from the perspective of my fellow cybersecurity practitioners. We want to maintain control. We want to get rid of onerous manual configurations, but we also want to maintain control from a security perspective. So, how can Tuebora enable us to do that?
So essentially, the question is about how do you determine uh, the human expertise and AI, and where do you leverage, one versus the other, right? That's the question, we have. So think of it as, we are not talking about getting rid of the entire, human workforce to manage your access and governance. Now, that's not the intent here. We want the folks to focus largely on more important things, right? So we want them to focus on strategy. We want them to focus on, how to bring in the risk control. We want them to focus on what policies, that need to get enforced and how to meet the regulatory obligations and all that. And what we will do with AI is help you achieve those goals that you have. So that's where I was talking about, where the human comes in with their goals and objectives, right? That's where they bring in their expertise about their environment and how they should be doing this. And where AI and the intelligence would come in is you. It helps you manage this in a way that the large configuration of workflows or complex integrations that you'll have to do, and the data that you have to move between systems, and then setting up these application specific rules, all of that, leave that burdensome work to intelligence. That's where you delegate your activities, and that's how you do the separation, right? So I think identity professionals, I believe, in the future will spend more time you know focusing on those objectives, building the boundaries around risk tolerance, because that is what it is, and then allowing for meaningful exceptions when it is needed, and then you know reading the signals that the system detected and saying, okay, this is where the gaps were, and now we have to expand our like I said, just the governance debt, and then leveraging the business context in solving some of those things, and then at the end of the day, um, you you know think of it as you have it's like that analogy I want to bring in is like an orchestra, right? You have somebody who is just responsible for getting the team together and just conducting the orchestra, whereas the groundwork, if you will, of making sure that the rhythm is in place, the tune is in motion, and the bass and everything else is coming together, is all done by these little agents, if you will, or people who are part of the orchestra, right? It's the same analogy here, and we want the specialist to conduct the orchestra and let the meaty work to be done by intelligence.
It feels like a shift in the industry similar to what I experienced when I first got into IT. I would build servers. I'd order them online, they'd show up in a box, I'd rack them, I'd pop a DVD in the drive, I'd install the operating system. Then we moved to virtual machines, like a VMware type environment. Soon enough virtual machine, anytime you needed a server, you just had to have enough resources available. And then ultimately you went to the cloud. And so it's kind of a shift from you're still doing the same the same job, but there's efficiencies built in. And I feel like an intelligence is going to help the identity practitioner go from that nitty gritty of like building an identity system into managing an environment and driving these outcomes. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think the difference is that in the past we were giving tasks to these systems, whether you call them servers with specified tasks and so on, was more deterministic in nature, right? You tell them exactly, here are the four things, you go ahead and do it, and you do it thrice a day or whenever it needs to get done. You let them execute based on the cadence you have specified. So the model here is similar to some extent. It's that you're delegating something to somebody, but that delegation is driven uh, not by a fixed scope, right? In terms of what needs to be done, but it is driven by the nature of your current state and what is happening in that environment, right? So you are, yes, you are delegating certain tasks, but at the same time, you leverage the system to take additional information that you have necessarily don't have access to it. And even if you have access to it, it is the magnitude of that data is significant, right? For you to be able to do anything meaningful with that information. And you would want to leverage, this, what human workers, or AI agents, as we want to call today, the digital workers, let them, do the activities on your behalf, and take things forward.
So we've been talking about using intelligence to um, really get efficiency out of identity governance and administration of identities. Now I'd like to talk about governance of a specific type of identity known as agentic identity. And so you're building some solutions for that. But I'd first like to start with what is your fundamental, or what is the fundamental argument on why agentic identities are different than people or service accounts? They feel a lot like service accounts in many ways. Why are they different? Why do they need to be treated differently?
Good question. See, I think the fundamental thing here is, if you look at a traditional service account, it is set up to do a specified function. It knows the interfaces it'll operate on, and it's a predefined window in which it operates, and it takes care of things, right? Everybody knows what it does and all that. In most of the cases, you have um, a situation where some of these things exist for a extended period of time. An AI agent works very differently, right? So it is actually looking at your goals, and it wants to identify what are the tools that it has to achieve those goals, right? And that's where it will use your data. It will use, it'll make some decisions on what tools it needs to use. Sometimes it would spawn other agents in the process and delegate the work to those agents so that they can do activities on its behalf. So there is a dynamic delegation that happens in the process. And so the flow has just gone from a specified set of activities that a human was doing to a more non-deterministic model that is based on the current situation and your intent, and then driving those. And that's why AI agents have become more interesting and more impactful for the organization, in terms of what they intend to do. And we find that it comes with its own challenges, right? Now we were able to figure out, the non-human identities and service account and all that, managing was a lot easier. Here, it makes it a lot more complex because the agents are very ephemeral, right? You don't know when they have been spawned and when they finish their work, and they are done before you figure out what happened, right? So it makes it harder when you have that kind of an environment, or a method of execution in terms of how you want to govern that. So things like uh, a structured approach would be needed to solve some of these, right? Who or what created that agent? Was it a human or a process or another agent? And who owns it? And what is it accountable for? What is the scope of execution? What policies should govern the execution engine for that agent, right? And what is the tools and capabilities that we want to support for that? And then what actions can it take autonomously, and what actions does it require a human intervention and a human approval, right? And then the delegation itself, what kind of things can you allow it to be delegated? And then the duration of this, what happened. And along this sequence of activities, you really want explainability from the from those systems, and have the auditability. And sometimes you may or may not get that, so it becomes complex in terms of how you have to govern. So it's almost like you get to a point where you really want to look at the agent and its intent and understand that. It's almost like asking for, give me what this thing can do, in terms of its activity. So then you can build policies, controls, and boundaries to say, this is where its legitimacy is going to be, right? This is where you are going to manage it, and that's where that governance will come into play. And it has to be policy driven, right? It's completely just like workforce governance, or even non-human identity governance. AI agent governance also should be very policy driven, because policy is the one that gives you the framework through which these can be managed, and scoped and executed. So in many ways you can think of it as a natural extension of identity governance. Whereas when you think about identity governance, it's always was associated with a person, a live or a human being, right? Somebody who has an authority, somebody who's been given some permissions to do this. Here, you know unlike the human case where some of those relationships are kind of static in nature, here it just becomes dynamic in nature. So these relationships are built at runtime based on the circumstances, based on the context, based on the decision it takes. So you want to see what are the potential relationships that can come into play here as well. And so the traditional governance problem has just expanded because the scope is increasing, and the so volume of AI agents is expected to go manifold, and that's where it becomes a very interesting problem to solve, and also makes it very challenging for IM community.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot there, right? You talked about the ephemeral nature. You talked about one thing I didn't hear you talk about so much was just the pure scale of the number of agentic identities that that makes it a lot different. I mean, when I was at Identiverse, the kind of running joke, and I heard this several times with people, where people say, well, I heard 45 to 1. Oh, yeah, so and so over here said 80 to 1. And I heard over 100 to 1, agentic identities to humans. And so it became kind of an ongoing joke, because it's like, how do you even know what the number is of humans or of agents? So, but we know it's going to be a lot. And by a lot, we probably are talking tens of thousands. So that's another challenge. The ephemeral nature, I think, is probably even the bigger challenge. But then if you're talking tens of thousands, if you're talking 100 to 1, if you're talking about another thing that you brought up, if you think about governance today, it's humans either approving or declining access or delegating it to somebody else. When the number grows that big, it's just not feasible for a human to approve it, right? So then it has to shift into some form of intelligent automation. And I'm wondering, like, this is kind of, I guess, shifting to the how. How do you approach that? Um, I guess this is something that you've solved over at Tuebora, or at least you're working on the solution, right?
That's correct. So absolutely, I think nobody knows what that mapping is. You talked about whatever 45, 80, whatever those numbers are, but it's very evident that every individual in an organization has a set of tools that they are using, and those tools internally use the agents to do a bunch of different work, right? And it's on a continuous basis that happens. But I think the the framework with which these actions are done does not change, right? The framework is still going to be continuous governance, and it is driven through policies. I think it doesn't matter what uh, kind of identity we're dealing with, that doesn't change, right? And you have to drive it through policies, and that gives you the clear definitions in terms of boundaries, the purpose for which something needs to be done, and how some things need to be addressed. Now, again, the other point you made was, well, we have to at some point want the agent to make those decisions. We can't have human, coming in and approving those decisions. Absolutely, we really cannot explain, or expect people to have, that kind of involvement, and kind of defeats the purpose if we start doing that to a large extent. So, I think the model that needs to happen is, like I said, if you have policy and you build, the agent's boundaries, and then you have this progressive trust of what the agent should do. A lot of times, the agent's scope is not defined, and that causes the problem. But you have to build a scope for the agent, and that's runtime. It's not static. You're just not going to give the scope, upfront. These are all the possible things you can do, right? That's not what it is, right? It's about at runtime, what is it that you are going to allow delegation for, and then bringing in that accountability, right? Just because you have that kind of scale, the need for accountability does not go away, right? So you bring in uh, policy, you have a well-defined scope, and you bring in this explainability, into the mix of things. I think uh, those things will allow you to make an environment successful with AI agents, without having to worry about what they are performing, in terms of what the intent is. So if you ask, if you're constantly asking the question, was it authenticated, was it authorized, was it driven through a policy, was it through allowed delegation, is it within scope, and do I have explainability for it? All of these things will help build that model, in terms of the governance itself.
Sanjay, you've been so gracious with your time today, but I did want to ask one kind of closing question, which is if you were to make or to give one piece of advice for the practitioners out there of what they should be paying attention to or preparing for in the next few years. And it's funny because I wrote this question down and I wrote in the next 5 years, and I thought that's 2031 and we're going to be in AGI by then, which I'm not even sure I've fully grasped what that means. But nonetheless, I think our planning cycles are shorter than 5 years now. But what's something that you would encourage identity practitioners to be thinking about for the next few years that they'll wish they had started sooner?
Sure. I think, I'd like to use one analogy that I think would help. I think identity is very much like golf, if you ask me. It is. It all looks simple from a distance, and success actually depends on understanding the environment, right? You really need to know, on that day, and what's happening with variables that are happening in that environment. And every course is different, right? And every situation is different. Similarly, in identity, every organization is different. They have different applications, different needs, different policies, different uh, controls and regulatory requirements that they would have. So pick something that would help you have a model where your governance is continuous. So do not live with a static model, right? Where you start your program, you get a bunch of things set up, configured, and you think that automation in place, you've reached your milestone. No, that's just the beginning. So you have to treat it as a continuous process. So the moment you treat it as a continuous process, which means that how do you bring in intelligence so that your continuous processes are going to be effective and giving you the right outcomes. And make sure as you're driving through your outcomes that there is explainability in every action, whether it's an action that you as the authorized person took, or the AI agent, or something that you delegated for that action. There is explainability for that. So the future is going to be, I would say, less about people coming in and doing that configuration. It's more about understanding the environment, bringing in policy, and then having clear explanation and having continuous governance, and then make sure your governance debt kind of is in control, and you are on top of that on a regular basis.
So, Sanjay, you're in India Standard Time, right? In Bangalore. I'm in Mountain Standard Time Mountain Daylight Time in South Dakota right now. So it's 11 and a half hour difference. I started the call at 8 a.m., 7:30 for you, right? And so I appreciate you staying up late. This is fortunately for me the beginning of my day, and it's been a great way to start the day. I was just thinking about how we met is at the EIC conference in May in Berlin. And it's so great that we can have these virtual calls, on opposite sides of the world. We can meet somewhere in between at a conference. And that to me is like one of the biggest things about conferences is the ability to just shake hands and get to see people in person and maybe have coffee or, have a meal or something like that. So looking forward to seeing you. What is the next conference you have lined up? Are you going to be at any of the conferences in the US coming up soon?
Yeah. The next one that I can think of is, we're looking forward to the Gartner Identity Access Management, end of the year. There are a few other, events and workshops that we'll be part of, but the biggest one that is what we're looking forward to is, at the end of the year in Las Vegas.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, look forward to seeing you at Gartner. Jeff and I have been to the last 4 Gartner IAM summits, so all the way back in Vegas. Then it switched to Grapevine,
Dallas.
Texas, and it's back to Vegas
Yeah.
this year. So, yeah, it should be fun. Looking forward to seeing you there. And I will close the episode out now. You can find us on idacpodcast.com. Download this podcast. Obviously, you're listening to it somewhere or watching it, but we are on YouTube. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify. Pretty much any podcast platform that you use, you can find us. You can also find Tuebora at tuebora.com/IDAC. Should have mentioned that earlier in the episode, but it's tuebora.com/IDAC, and you'll be able to download a lot more information. And please connect to myself and Jeff on LinkedIn. Sanjay, are you also open to connections on LinkedIn?
Absolutely. Happy to get connected and engage and converse with whoever is interested in these topics that we discussed today.
Sounds great. Well, Sanjay, thank you for your time. And everyone, we will talk to you on the next one.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.